If there's one game that's been analysed to death more than any other on YouTube, then, well, okay, it's probably Ocarina of Time. But Dark Souls is a close second, and it's not hard to see why. Just like Link's Adventure in 1998, 2011's Dark Souls was a groundbreaking game that rewrote the rulebook on action game design. Its now iconic bonfire checkpoints, refillable healing items, stamina management, and high committal combat have been copied by so many imitators that we now have a name for a genre of Souls-like games. And plenty of other genres were affected too, with many a marketing department aiming to brand their game as the Dark Souls of whatever genre they were making. And its developer, FromSoftware, was catapulted to absolute superstardom overnight. 10 years later, their upcoming Elden Ring is one of the most highly anticipated games in the industry. No small feat for a project that still hasn't actually shown any official gameplay, and proof that FromSoft can do no wrong in the eyes of most fans. And the company is clearly banking on that goodwill from its fans, because the release of Dark Souls also brought with it a profound shift in the way FromSoft would work from then on, as they increasingly started putting all of their eggs into one big basket-shaped project after another. In the 2000s, FromSoft was releasing several games a year, 6 in 2004, and I think it's safe to say that back then they were a firmly AA studio that was successful in its niche and not really outside of it. But after the surprising success of Demon's Souls, and then the less surprising but much more impressive success of the spiritual sequel, FromSoft began to focus on bigger, more ambitious titles, and was only releasing one game a year. In fact, 2017 didn't see any new FromSoft releases at all, and I'm only counting this 2018 VR game so that pedants don't come at me in the comments. The director behind the first Souls games, Hidetaka Miyazaki, became the president of the company a few years after Dark Souls released, and has remained the director on every major game from the studio except for Dark Souls 2, which, nope, I'm not getting into that. I've always felt that the Souls series had a kind of virgin effect to it, where your first exposure to it is the one you never forget and the one that leaves the biggest impression on you. For me, that was Demon's Souls, which I played on the PS Triple back in 2013, after its stepbrother Dark Souls had already come out and taken the world by storm. So I was going in excited to see what the big deal was, and even with my high expectations, I still got my mind blown. When I just barely made it through the very first area of the game, pulled a lever to open a door, and it dawned on me that I had just opened a safe shortcut back to the bridge where I'd started, I remember turning to a friend that was watching me play and saying, "Oh my god, this is amazing." Unfortunately, the other side of that coin is that you can only experience something for the first time once, and while they were still among the better games of the decade, after a trilogy of Dark Souls titles, that feeling that you were playing something groundbreaking was getting more and more distant. And FromSoft seemed to be aware of that fact, because 3 years after the final Souls game, their next major release would be a departure from the norm and another sorely needed attempt at making something fresh. In other words, their next game was the studio's chance to rewrite the rulebook all over again, and give players that first time feeling they once got from Souls way back in the day. It was their chance to make the Dark Souls of FromSoft games. So, did they pull it off? Well, kind of. The answer is complicated. Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, is not without its shortcomings, but if you buckle down and take it head on, you'll find a game that is as rewarding as it is challenging, with an original take on the now standard Souls mechanics that really does get close to recapturing that magic. There's an in-your-face story that's easier to understand than the Souls games, with more defined characters that have clear goals and motivations, but still enough hidden lore to keep the lights on in Vati Vidya's house for another 2 years. The bonfires and healing mechanics are pretty much unchanged, and some areas even have shortcuts to discover and open, but the Souls series' staple stamina system has been replaced with a posture meter. The consequences of dying have been changed from the usual soul retrieval run, and other features like character builds are not present at all. On top of all that, there are now stealth elements? I can't be the only one who was a little skeptical when they first heard that back before the game released, but thankfully my skepticism was unfounded, and almost all of the changes made to the Souls formula are positive. Yeah, almost. We'll get to all that. Without a doubt, the biggest changes that take some getting used to are the differences in combat. In the Souls games you have a stamina bar under your health which is drained by most actions you can perform. Sprinting, attacking, dodging and blocking enemy attacks all drain your stamina, which will constantly refill itself when you're not doing any of these things, although holding up your shield causes it to refill more slowly, and a completely empty stamina bar will stop you from performing any actions. From this small set of rules, a fairly complex system emerges because the same resource is used for pretty much every significant action in combat, meaning that every choice you make affects the choices you're able to make next. Needless to say, I think this stamina bar is a genius piece of design, and it's the source of a huge amount of the Souls combat system's depth. Sure, you can equip different weapons with different movesets, stats and damage values, but your equipment will always abide by the rules set out by this stamina bar. All of this means that your moves in Souls are high committal, and you're encouraged to act with intentionality, so much so that most actions can't be cancelled once you've pressed the button. If you start an attack and then decide you want to block or roll instead, you're already dead. Sekiro bravely throws absolutely all of this out the window and starts from scratch, a decision that FromSoft deserves some credit for. As usual, you have a health bar, but instead of a stamina bar you now have a posture meter, which starts at 0 and increases when you either block an attack by holding the button, or deflect an attack by pressing it with perfect timing. It also increases when an enemy blocks your attacks. Like with the stamina bar, doing nothing will cause the posture meter to reset back to its original state, but in Sekiro, holding block causes this to happen faster, not slower. The state of your health bar also affects the speed at which your posture recovers, with lower health resulting in a slower posture recovery. If the posture meter is filled completely, the next attack you block will throw you off balance and leave you totally vulnerable to a killing blow for a second. Already you can see this is a significant departure from the Souls formula, but the kicker is this. Whereas the enemies in Souls are not under the same stamina limitations as you, in Sekiro every enemy has their own posture bar which follows the same rules as yours. FromSoftware's stated goal with Sekiro's combat was to nail the feeling of swords clashing, and that laser focus definitely shines through, to the extent where anything extraneous to it has been simplified or just removed. The daring choice was made to only have one main weapon in the game, with only 2 possible attacks you can perform with it, a slash and a slightly slower and higher damage thrust. On top of that, the high committal to moves seen in Souls is gone, as you can cancel out of an attack into a block or a deflection if your sword hasn't started swinging yet. This means that you're not punished for being bold and getting in close to enemies. In fact, you're usually rewarded for it if you have the skill to back up your boldness. It took me a good few hours of playing Sekiro to fully understand the implications of this combat system, but if you've played it for yourself then you already know just how different this makes the combat from that of the Souls games, and it has an equal amount of depth to it. If you've seen my video on the boss fights of Hollow Knight, you might remember that I found one of the hallmarks of a complex combat system to be the ability for high and low skill players to express themselves through different playstyles, and that holds true in Sekiro as well. While your goal is still to get your enemy's health to 0, you now have more than one way to do it. If you're cautious, or if you're seeing an enemy for the first time, you'll probably keep your distance and only move in to deal some chip damage to their health when they're vulnerable after one of their own attacks, and the lower you can get the enemy's health, the easier it is to build posture damage, as they'll recover more slowly. If you've learned your way around an enemy, however, you'll be staying close for the whole fight to maximize posture damage to them as you deflect each of their attacks, while keeping up a barrage of your own to throw them off balance for an instant kill death blow. While you could think of Sekiro's posture meter as a resource that gets affected by both offense and defense, like the stamina meter in Souls, you can always attack in Sekiro regardless of how full the meter is, and a perfectly timed deflection will never result in a posture break, even if the meter is full. In fact, having a full posture meter can be ignored entirely if you deflect every blow, and only becomes a problem worth dealing with if you're not certain of your ability to pull that off. In other words, you're no longer limited by a stamina resource like you were in Souls. You're only limited by your skill, self-confidence and hesitation. And while Sekiro does allow you to increase your health and attack power after certain major battles, what actually makes the biggest difference is that you get better at the game. and as you get further into Sekiro, you'll notice this when foes that felt like roadblock mini-bosses at the beginning return later on as regular enemies that you should now be able to dominate with your newfound skill. With all of this in play, combat in Sekiro really can end up feeling like a desperate clash of swords, and on top of the posture meters, there's a fair amount of variation between bosses that make most fights memorable in some way. There are bosses that charge around, making it harder to fill their posture meter as they keep moving out of your range and encouraging you to grapple onto them to keep up aggression. There's a boss that spawns illusions and forces you into crowd control. There's even a fight against another shinobi who uses your own dirty tricks against you to get the upper hand. But there's one fight that stands out in my memory as the high point of how good Sekiro's frantic combat can feel, and that's the encounter with the armoured warrior on the bridge of Senpo Temple. I noticed as I began to fight him that his health didn't go down at all when I attacked him, and he kept gloating about his impenetrable armour. So when I shifted my focus to his posture meter and finally threw him off balance for a killing blow, I found that even then he still couldn't be damaged. At this point I started to get nervous as the usual strategies weren't working on this enemy. But as we continued to trade blows and he swung his massive sword around, destroying the sides of the bridge as he did so, an idea suddenly came to me for how to use that against him. The next time I threw him off balance for a death blow, I tried to get him near the edge of the bridge, and then... something about this brutal death after such a desperate struggle for survival made my jaw hit the floor when I saw this, and that feeling was 1,000 times stronger for the fact that I did it on my first try. And I'm not bringing that up just to dab on you for being a noob, even though you are one. Without having to go through the immersion-breaking loop of dying and retrying until I got it right, I was totally under the game's spell, and I bought into the life or death nature of my struggle completely, which is why I felt such an insane rush when I survived it. But I'd be remiss not to mention that this is a pretty rare occurrence in Sekiro, because the game is hard as nails, and it doesn't give you anything for free. You can't summon other players like you can in Souls, so you really have to dig your heels in and engage with Sekiro to get anywhere, but I'll come back to the point of difficulty a little later on. Of course, that experience I had on the bridge is Sekiro's combat at its absolute best, and unfortunately it's not always this good, with perhaps the lowest points coming when you're forced into fights against multiple enemies. This isn't an issue when the enemies are weak and die quickly, because then you can shift your focus to positioning and making sure you don't get overwhelmed. But when you're facing multiple strong foes at once that would demand concentration even if they were alone, it becomes seriously frustrating, and I'm still not sure what the hell you're supposed to do other than kite around them waiting for a rare opportunity where both of them are in between attacks. Fighting multiple enemies was always an issue in the Souls games as well, where the most boring and cautious strategies ended up being the most effective. But in Sekiro the problem feels even worse because the sword clashing combat seems to have been specifically made with one-on-one fights in mind. Thankfully this is a pretty minor criticism, because while there are some baffling moments where you're forced into encounters against multiple strong enemies, it can mostly be avoided, and I think it's mostly supposed to be avoided. In fact, against that boss I mentioned who spawns illusions, you're heavily encouraged to use a consumable that instantly dispels them, even though you could deal with the mob the normal way if you wanted to. But outside of boss fights, the most common way you'll be avoiding fights against multiple enemies is by making use of the other string in Sekiro's shinobi bow, stealth. When you first enter an area, none of the enemies will be aware of you, including any mini-bosses that might be around, and the death blows from Sekiro's combat easily carry over to the stealth mechanics. If you can get behind an unaware enemy, you can perform a death blow for an instant kill just like in combat, with the same red dot appearing so that there's no ambiguity over whether you're in the right spot for a backstab. Dark Souls, I'm looking at you. But you're not just limited to backstabs, oh no. You can also pull off aerial plunging attacks, because Sekiro's stealth mechanics go hand in hand with a much freer and much more vertical movement system, complete with a grappling hook for instantly gaining height and getting out of overwhelming encounters. Entering a new area in Sekiro will probably end up looking something like this. You stay out of sight, picking off lone enemies as you go and identifying the stronger ones that either need to be prioritized with an instant death blow or saved for last if they're a mini-boss with multiple death blow counters. Once you've thinned out the ranks, you can go in for the stealth attack on the mini-boss, which will only remove one of their death blow counters, leaving you to cross swords with them for the other one. And with fights against multiple enemies feeling as broken as they do, you're definitely going to want to deal with everyone else before this happens. When you've taken out all the enemies and fully explored the area around a bonfire, you'll discover that many have shortcuts that you don't unlock by opening doors or kicking down ladders, but simply by gaining knowledge about the area and noticing grapple points that you normally wouldn't see when going the long way, which is a nice trick that makes movement feel versatile without making combat against normal enemies feel like a waste of time, since you'll definitely want to dispatch them on your first exploratory trip through a region. Stealth was another part of Sekiro that took me a few hours to understand and appreciate the complexity of, especially given how seamlessly it blends with the combat mechanics, and it also throws enough variety at you to constantly keep you thinking about your strategy. In the foothills of Mount Kongo, leading up to Senpo Temple, you'll encounter wandering groups of Senpo monks that present you with tons of choices to make about which to prioritize and where best to get the drop on them. Elsewhere in Ashina Castle, you can stalk the rooftops to jump down on the unsuspecting guards below, but you'll find Nightjar Ninja waiting for you up there as well, who are almost as agile as you and are tougher to sneak up on. There's genuine strategy involved in identifying which order you should take enemies out. I could go on to describe the combat arts or prosthetic tools you can equip that add extra options to your moveset, but honestly I don't think their inclusion adds that much to the game, or at the very least I never found much use for most of them. You have Shuriken, which do what you would expect, a flamethrower which red-eyed enemies have a weakness to, firecrackers which beasts and animals have a weakness to, and an axe which shield-bearing enemies have a weakness to, which is pretty much only useful in one area of the game. There are others, but that sentence was long enough already and I think you get the idea. The overly specific nature of many of the prosthetic tools makes them feel more like keys to locks rather than open-ended tools, and unless a boss has an obvious weakness, then I usually didn't bother using them at all. The game hinted that I should make heavy use of the firecrackers against the first major boss, Gyobu, and the following mini-boss, Blazing Bull, but by the time I reached the Guardian Ape much later in the game, I'd totally forgotten about them and I beat him without using the firecrackers at all. In any case, just like in Souls, where weapon choice and character builds are embellishments on the simple foundation that is the stamina system, Sekiro, also having relatively simple rules that govern its combat and stealth systems, gives the player a vast amount of options and strategies that can work within that rule set. There's almost never a single solution to a given combat scenario, and I really felt like I had the freedom to develop my own strategy and style as I played. Take this attack from the first phase of the real final boss for an example, which it took me a few attempts to develop a repeatable response for. Oof, just look at that, when a character sheaths their sword before an attack you just know some serious shit is about to go down. If you have some distance between you, Ishin quickly closes the gap with a couple of high damage slashes that take some tight timing to deflect and can easily catch you off guard. If on the other hand you close the distance yourself and get in close, Ishin will perform a modified version of the move, with a quick slash you can deflect, followed by a sweep that can be countered for high posture damage if you time your jump just right. Once I'd settled on my strategy, it then took me a few more tries to actually nail my execution, but then I was able to pull it off consistently. Once you've done something like this for every move in a boss's repertoire, you can get into a kind of call and response dance with your enemy that feels great and makes you want to keep going for as long as you can, not unlike many of the bosses in Hollow Knight. In this move you can also see another example of how Sekiro rewards you for being bold and taking the initiative in combat, in this case by giving you the chance to make use of a high damage counter. The encounter with Genichiro, which serves as the prelude to this final boss, also demonstrates that quite handily, as getting in close as possible to him allows you to have far more control over the fight, and end it in half a minute with one long combo if you already have responses prepared for each of his moves. Needless to say, it feels absolutely amazing to pull this off. But now I'm going to Mikiri counter all of this positivity with a bit of negative criticism, because While it is true that Sekiro gives you tons of options to deploy in combat, it's also true that many situations have clearly dominant responses, sometimes incredibly so. Some enemy attacks are better off blocked, some are better dodged, some better countered, and some better cancelled out with a faster attack of your own. When you see the icon flash up to indicate a move that can be countered, for example, it's kind of a no-brainer what response you should perform. Although in fairness, you do still have to pay attention to the animation because the icon doesn't tell you whether to expect a sweep to jump over or a thrust to stomp on. Of course, these high damage counters are just another incentive that pushes you towards an aggressive playstyle, but the deeper you get into Sekiro, the more you're punished for not playing in this aggressive style. While Sekiro's dodge does have invincibility frames, the timing is really tight, making it risky to rely on, and in addition to that, almost every enemy attack has heavy tracking and will follow you even if you try to dodge. This means that in the vast majority of situations, you're better off attempting to deflect enemy attacks rather than dodging, unless you know for sure that dodging an attack, usually an overhead slash, will leave you in a position for an opportunistic swipe of your own. Naturally, this emphasis on blocking over dodging makes perfect sense considering the sword clashing thing that FromSoft was going for, but it will take some serious getting used to for fans that are coming directly from the Souls games, which have much more generous iframes on their dodges. I think that emphasis is why a lot of the negative Steam reviews for Sekiro tend to disparagingly boil it down to little more than a rhythm game, and I definitely wouldn't go that far, but I can see where they're coming from. You see this icon, you push this button. See a sword swing, push that button. Positioning doesn't really have that much importance in combat when you can stand still and tap the right buttons. Instead, timing is the skill that will carry you through Sekiro. Kind of like a rhythm game. I'm not sure if it's fair to criticize Sekiro directly for its steeper learning curve compared to Souls, since if it was made by a different developer, I might not even be making the comparison at all. But failing to click with the game's combat is undoubtedly the biggest reason why people give up on it, and I do think it remains undeniable that Sekiro could have done more to teach newcomers about the best way to play. It's not until a good distance into the game that a mini-boss appears to specifically test you on your deflecting skills, and it wasn't until I reached this mini-boss on my first playthrough that I finally realised just how important it was. Up to that point, I'd managed to fumble my way through each major combat encounter by getting lucky with dodges, playing cautiously and dealing chip damage, or making use of enemy weaknesses to my shinobi prosthetic tools. Gyobu, who is the first major boss and who appears before that deflection skill check, doesn't block your attacks and always takes health damage when you strike him, meaning that you can actually defeat him without properly understanding the full importance of posture in combat. And even after that skill check mini-boss, I still didn't really learn my lesson and I kept trying to avoid attacks rather than taking them head on, although by that point I'm willing to accept part of the blame for not picking up what the game was trying to teach me. But either way, the second half of Sekiro will seriously punish you for not understanding the way you're supposed to play, as it throws bosses at you who can block most of your attacks and give you barely any opportunities to deal safe damage without exposing yourself. And I don't think the first half does quite enough to nudge you towards the aggressive, sword-clashing playstyle that's pretty much mandatory to defeat them. The game allows you to stumble your way through that first half, then suddenly throws up a brick wall that no amount of stumbling will be able to knock down. Just to be clear, I'm absolutely not asking for the game to be casualized or made easier. I hope that I've already proven myself on this channel as someone who enjoys the reward of digging into difficult games. But there is a difference between failing a challenge because of a lack of practice or skill, and failing a challenge because of a lack of training or understanding. When you know what you need to do, but just need to get good enough to do it, well, there's your motivation to keep going right there. But when you have no idea what you're supposed to be doing, well, that's bound to be a source of frustration. And speaking of sources of frustration, I've saved my most hated part of the game for last. And yes, I know hate is a strong word, and no, I don't care. I hate the way death has been revamped in Sekiro. I don't have a problem with the resurrection mechanic, where you can revive yourself using a token that recharges either from resting at a bonfire or from dispatching enemies. In fact, my thoughts on Resurrection are pretty positive, and I think it's a merciful inclusion given what I'm about to get into. It has limited uses and it can't be used twice in quick succession, but if you rest it at a bonfire then you'll always have at least one resurrection token available, and the fact that you get to choose whether to resurrect or not is a brilliant idea because it means you can save your tokens for boss attempts that you feel more confident about, rather than being forced to waste them on your doomed first try. So what could be so bad it made me whip out the H word earlier? Well, when you die for real and don't or can't resurrect, you lose 50% of your experience and money. End of story. You don't leave a bloodstain you can go back to retrieve your resources, they're just gone. And yes, you have a 30% chance that unseen aid will kick in and you won't lose anything, but since you can't rely on random chance and have to assume that that won't happen, you're heavily incentivized to either spend all your money and bank your experience before a difficult encounter so that you lose as few resources as possible when you're stuck retrying it, or make sure that you avoid dying at any cost. In both cases, this results in an incredibly tedious experience. To spend all of your coin, you need to travel to a merchant, possibly several if one doesn't have enough stock. And to bank your experience, you need to find a spot to farm enough enemies to fill your XP bar and turn it into a skill point that won't be lost upon death. The other solution, to avoid dying at all cost, can end up feeling even more tedious, and the most logical way to avoid it is to fight until you have to use your first resurrection, then run back to a bonfire to reset the area and keep trying again until you succeed. This feels like an absurd waste of your time, but it's a strategy that Sekiro encourages by so strongly disincentivizing death. In fact, you're even further encouraged to avoid death by the Dragon Rot mechanic, which sees friendly NPCs become afflicted with the Dragon Rot disease the more times you fully die. While afflicted, an NPC can't have their side quest progressed, and the more NPCs are afflicted, the lower your chance of receiving unseen aid becomes. Restoring them to health requires the use of a consumable that only exists in a finite amount. So again, you'll be falling back on boring and cautious play to avoid fully dying and seeing this happen. I respect the attempt at trying something different from the Souls formula, but the harsh consequences of death in Sekiro just don't work for me at all, and introduce a truly frustrating problem that was never present in the Souls games. At its worst, all of this together can feel like a game-breakingly bad design decision, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a contributing factor to the shameful secret I'm just about to reveal. So here at the end I have to make a confession. I actually did give up on Sekiro during my first playthrough. I managed to beat Genichiro at the top of Ashina Castle, and I even defeated the corrupted monk in the depths of Mibu Village, so I was maybe halfway through the game, but I still hadn't properly come to understand the combat system, and I could feel that I was losing steam to keep going. And funnily enough, it was the fight with the armoured warrior on the Senpo Temple Bridge that stopped me in my tracks and had me putting down my controller. Yes, the fight that stood out as the highlight of my second playthrough was the roadblock that ended my first, and while that fight can shine as a beacon at the pinnacle of what Sekiro is able to achieve, it can also make a perfect example of what the game gets wrong. One of the prosthetic tools you can equip is a spear that can supposedly remove armor from enemies, so given that several previous bosses had been weak to certain tools, in my doomed first playthrough I assumed, in my opinion very logically, that I would have to use the spear to remove the im from the impenetrable armor of the bridge warrior. I tried this a few times, not understanding what I was getting wrong, and since I still hadn't fully clicked with the combat system, eventually I lost enough steam that I just said, fuck this, and I put the controller down. I'm very glad that I picked it back up a few months later and started Sekiro again, because thanks to that successful second playthrough, it has now cemented itself as one of my favourite action games. But I think that my abandoned first playthrough is indicative of the game's biggest problem. Specifically when it leaves you unsure of what exactly it wants from you. Sekiro gives the player a lot of combat options right from the beginning, but the further you get into the game, the fewer of those options are truly viable, and anyone who makes it that far and is still pressing dodge when they should be pressing block is in for a bad time. But despite all that, if you can climb up Sekiro's difficulty curve and plant your flag atop it, you'll discover an amazingly satisfying game that will leave you glad you persevered. To anyone else who hit a roadblock and lost their motivation to keep going, I'd really recommend starting a new game so that you can tear through the easier early areas with the knowledge you've hopefully gained from later ones. You might just see how rewarding the game can feel when you're outpacing the difficulty curve and hitting the skill ceiling. So did they pull it off, the mad lads? Did Miyazaki manage to change the rules all over again and make Sekiro the Dark Souls of FromSoft games? Well, the answer is still kind of. Sekiro shakes up enough of the formula that you'll have to learn a lot from scratch when you first pick it up, but while it's closer than ever to feeling like that first Souls hit all over again, it just doesn't feel like the groundbreaking experience that Souls did. Which is fine, I mean, not every game has to set the world on fire. Sekiro is a fantastic game and it does things that are not just new to Souls games, but to action games in general. I can understand why it was given Game of the Year at so many awards shows, although I don't agree with that myself. But the more I think about it, the more I feel that it's going to take a lot for FromSoft to shake up the industry like that again, if it's even possible at all. We're definitely not going to see the Sekiro of first-person shooters become a meme like we did with Souls, that's for sure, and the industry has moved on from how it looked in 2011. And yet, at the risk of jumping on board the hype train, more than anything else, Sekiro fills me with hope that Miyazaki and his team at FromSoft still have it in them to take risks and at least try to innovate. And I think you'd struggle to name another big budget developer as worthy of respect and with as much integrity as they have. With reports reporting that Elden Ring is going to have a more open world structure, I wouldn't be surprised if Miyazaki has taken some inspiration from Breath of the Wild, but time will have to tell on that front. As far as combat is concerned, I hope that FromSoft has learned some lessons from Sekiro and is willing to experiment with something new. The stamina bar was milked for every drop it was worth in the last decade, so I think I'll be a little disappointed if we just end up back with the same old Souls mechanics again in Elden Ring. But if anyone is capable of rewriting the rules just like they did 10 years ago, well... Actually, you know what? Fuck it. Choo choo, motherfucker. Elden Ring 10 out of 10 best game of all time.